The millionaire walked into his mansion unannounced, expecting silence. Instead, he heard laughter, pure, childlike laughter echoing down the marble halls. Curious, he followed the sound. But when he reached the sunroom, he froze. His 6-year-old daughter was curled up in the lap of the maid, resting her head against the woman's chest, whispering stories and smiling like she had never smiled with anyone else. His heart sank, not with jealousy, but confusion. Why did it feel like he was the stranger in his own home? Jonathan Wells was a name people knew, a tech tycoon with billions under his belt, power in his stride, and distance in his eyes. His wife had passed 5 years ago during childbirth, leaving behind their daughter, Elara. Since then, Jonathan buried himself in work, turning grief into numbers, sorrow into silence. He loved his daughter, but love without presence feels more like an idea than a feeling. Elara grew up in the company of nannies, tutors, and housekeepers, her father always away. When Elara turned 6, an older maid quit suddenly, and the agency sent someone new, Nina, a quiet woman in her late 20s with gentle eyes and a calm voice. She was different. She didn't just clean or cook. She listened. She noticed when Elara was too quiet or when her drawings turned gray. And more than anything, she told stories. Fairy tales with brave little girls who saved the world. Stories where mothers watched from stars. Slowly, Elara smiled again. What Nina didn't tell anyone was her own story. She had once studied literature, dreamt of becoming a children's author, and had even sold a few stories before tragedy struck. Her own daughter, Hope, had passed away during a heart surgery 2 years ago. Grief led to homelessness, then recovery, and eventually to this job. She had sworn not to get attached, but Elara reminded her too much of the little girl she lost. Her giggle, her stubbornness, her loneliness. The day Jonathan came home early, he hadn't planned to. A canceled flight brought him back unexpectedly. He didn't expect to find his daughter, usually so reserved and proper, lying in the maid's arms, calling her Mimi, telling her about her day. The room was filled with warmth. Jonathan felt excluded, but he also saw something that pierced him. His daughter was happy. Truly, deeply happy. And it wasn't because of him. Jonathan didn't speak that night, but the next morning he called Nina to his study. He wasn't rude, but formal. "You've grown close to my daughter," he said. Nina didn't flinch. "Sir, she needs someone. She misses her mother." Jonathan replied, "I'm her father. I provide everything she needs." Nina looked at him, calmly but firmly. "You provide things. She needs love." That hit him harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. Jonathan spent the evening going through old photos, his late wife holding Elara as a baby, her smile, her warmth. He remembered promises he made during the funeral. "I'll be both parents," he had whispered. Instead, he ran away into work. That night, he knocked on Elara's door for the first time in months and read her a story. She looked surprised but happy. "Daddy, are you staying home now?" she asked. He didn't know the answer, but he hoped so. Nina, however, knew her days were numbered. Rich people didn't like staff getting too personal. She had seen it before. That night, she packed her few things quietly. But Elara saw her. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I have to go." Elara began crying uncontrollably. That's when Jonathan walked in and saw the scene again. His daughter clinging to the maid like she was losing a mother all over again. "She's not just a maid," Elara screamed. "She's my Mimi." Jonathan faced a decision: pride or parenting. For once, he chose the harder path. He told Nina to stay, not as a maid, but as Elara's companion, teacher, and, perhaps, someday, something more. "I can't replace your daughter," Elara whispered to Nina. "And I can't replace your wife," Nina whispered back to Jonathan. But maybe healing isn't about replacement. It's about holding space for each other's pain. Months passed. Jonathan worked less, smiled more. He and Nina began to have coffee in the mornings. They laughed, not like lovers, but like people waking up from a long sleep. Elara began drawing again. Pictures of all three of them holding hands under a sun with a big heart. The mansion, once cold and grand, now echoed with music, stories, and laughter. Years later, Nina published a children's book, The Girl Who Found 2 Stars. It was dedicated to E and J, for reminding me that broken hearts can still beat. On the launch night, Jonathan sat in the front row holding Elara's hand. "You came home unannounced once," Nina said in her speech. "And that's when our real story began." The crowd clapped. But Jonathan just looked at Alara, smiling, whole, loved, and knew that for the first time in a long time, he had finally come home. The lights were off when Jonathan Wells stepped into his mansion unannounced. He hadn't planned this visit. Just an earlier flight and a nagging emptiness brought him back. Expecting silence, he paused as gentle laughter floated from the sunroom. Curious, he followed the sound. There, under the fading afternoon light, his 6-year-old daughter Alara lay nestled against the Maid, giggling while the woman stroked her hair and told her a story. They looked like mother and child. And in that moment, Jonathan stood frozen, not with anger, but confusion. He hadn't heard his daughter laugh like that in years. And for the first time, he realized he might not know his own child. Jonathan Wells, one of the richest tech entrepreneurs in the country, had built his life around success, but it came at a cost. After losing his wife during childbirth, he poured himself into his company, trying to escape grief through meetings, mergers, and markets. His daughter, Alara, was raised by a rotation of caretakers, none staying long enough to build a connection. Jonathan told himself he was doing it all for her: money, stability, the best tutors, the biggest house. But in reality, he was running. Alara grew up in luxury, but with a quiet ache of absence. Her drawings always featured 2 people instead of 3. Her birthday candles were always blown alone. The new maid arrived quietly, her resume plain, her clothes modest, her face carrying a softness that hinted at deeper pain. Nina didn't stand out at first, but Alara noticed her calm. Unlike others, Nina didn't fill silence with chatter or command with rules. She asked questions. She sat on the floor during playtime. And more than anything, she listened. One rainy afternoon, she told Alara a story about a little girl who lost her mother but found strength in the stars. Alara listened with teary eyes and whispered, "Tell me another." From that day, they became inseparable. Alara started calling her Mimi, a nickname that felt like home. Nina never meant to get attached. She had taken the job to survive, not to heal. 2 years earlier, she had lost her own daughter, Hope, during a surgery she couldn't afford. It shattered her soul. Her marriage fell apart. Her writing dreams dissolved, and she ended up sleeping in her car before a women's shelter helped her restart. When the agency offered a live-in housekeeping role, she took it. She hadn't known Alara then. But Alara's eyes, her curiosity, her loneliness, it all reminded Nina too much of Hope. Each bedtime story, each whispered secret, each hug was both comfort and torment. She had promised herself not to love again. But how could she not? Jonathan hadn't been home in weeks. Business had taken him to Tokyo, then Berlin, then Dubai. But something in him, an exhaustion that wasn't physical, brought him home early one evening. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up, briefcase in hand, expecting the usual: silence, cold dinners, a nod from the butler. But instead, he heard laughter. Real laughter. He followed the sound and saw it. That moment in the sunroom that shattered his detachment. Alara, glowing. Nina, holding her like a daughter. And for the first time, Jonathan realized he was the outsider in his own home. Jonathan didn't say a word that evening. He dined alone in his study, staring at his daughter's untouched drawings on the wall. The next morning, he called Nina to speak. His voice was even, but guarded. "You've gotten close to Alara," he said, more as a statement than a question. Nina stood firm. "She's a child who needs someone." Jonathan replied coldly, "She has me." Nina looked at him, pain flashing in her eyes. "She needs more than your name on a bank account." It wasn't disrespect, it was truth. And Jonathan, for the first time in years, had no response. Alone that night, Jonathan opened a locked drawer. Inside were old photographs, his wife laughing, holding baby Alara, their first family trip, her last note before the surgery. Guilt poured through him like ice. He had promised her he'd be there for Alara, be both father and mother. But he had failed. He had built an empire but lost his way as a parent. That night, he stood at Alara's door. She was asleep, hugging a stuffed fox Nina had given her. For the first time in years, he sat beside her bed and whispered, "I missed so much." Nina had seen the signs before. The wealthy didn't like it when staff got too close. The tone in Jonathan's voice, the way he watched, she knew she'd be let go soon. That night, She began packing quietly, but Alara saw